Hello and welcome. I'm Samantha Libreri and we're live on RTE's social platforms and the RTE News channel to talk about 1 year of pandemic living. It's been a life-changing 12 months and it's often felt like an emotional roller coaster. We've heard lots of facts and figures about the pandemic, but today we're going to focus on how we're feeling. We asked you on Instagram what it is you miss most this past year and the reaction was huge, but there were some recurring themes. Here's a sample of what you've been telling us. Now, to look at this in more detail, we have Paul Dalton, who's an Associate Professor of Psychology at UCD here in studio, and Niamh Hourigan, who's a Professor of Sociology from Mary Immaculate College in our Limerick studio. Thank you both for coming in to talk to us. Paul, can I start with you? You saw the things there that our audience say that they've been missing most and feeling. Can you give us a sense of the psychological toll that the pandemic has taken on us?
I mean, an enormous psychological toll. And as you said, we're very used to hearing the facts and figures, and they're really important. But what has gone, sometimes unrecognised, is the emotional toll that this has taken. We as a people have been living for 12 months now with an elevated level of stress. And we all know that, you know, the sleeplessness, the problem with memory, the kind of feeling on edge, the jitteriness. So it's kind of like, Samantha, we are living with a little kind of threat in the background all the time. So we're living in fear. That old kind of fight or flight response is kind of turned on a little bit all the time for us. So that actually, what that does is activate the nervous system, activates the body. So we find ourselves, you know, hyper vigilant, that kind of on high alert. And you know, it's not surprising when we hear what people miss. They miss physical contact because the nervous system, our little bodies and our little minds respond to touch. They respond to the soothing. A parent knows this. They hold a child closely when it's distressed. We're just the same as adults, you know? And that's it. Kind of what helps us cope in a time of crisis, and we know this from the research, is human contact, is social contact. And what we've had to endure is social distance, probably at a time when it is most necessary. But this is where we find ourselves, you know. So I think that connection, something between the kind of brain and the body. Somebody was talking recently about the 4 a.m. terrors. That an increasing number of people talking about how their sleep is disturbed. They're waking up much earlier in the morning. So we have to find ways to manage and to kind of and to dance around the situation that we find ourselves in at the moment.
And coming to you, Niamh, do you think that the pandemic has changed us as a people?
I do, and I think those changes actually are not necessarily the same for everyone. I think they're impacted on a number of levels. I think our age is particularly important. I think there's particularly distinct impacts on elderly people and on teenagers, funny enough. One of the things I would have noticed is when at the first stage of the pandemic, when older people were being told that they had to cocoon, and in some cases they would have been older people who wouldn't necessarily have seen themselves as old. They might have still been working, they might have still had very active lives, and suddenly they're being told cocoon and stay at home. And I think that has had quite a profound, and will have have a long-term impact on them. The other group that I think have been really challenged have been teenagers, because teenagers need their peers to meet their developmental goals, and they have had to stay at home. And of course, they're a group, the early teens, who are still at home, who are still out of school. And I think the impact of the pandemic on them will be long and profound. But really, it's impacted on everyone, and we can see it in the range of value surveys that we've had. Behaviour and Attitudes have done. We and Mary in conjunction with UL have done surveys, and we're seeing quite significant value change happening over this period. Okay. I suppose the question will be how long it'll last.
Okay, coming back to you, Paul, there's a sense that the mood has really changed between the first lockdown and this lockdown, that people are feeling very differently. What is it that's changed for people?
You know, my mother described this, I mean, as an older person, said, you know, this time last year, it felt like we were setting out on an adventure. Not an adventure we wanted, but now it's drudgery, you know, so second, kind of third time round. We are depleted as a people. We are finding ourselves in these situations where our social contact is becoming smaller and smaller and smaller. And we are, we're tired. We're looking at a number of people who are multitasking. I look at parents, you know, who are homeschooling, who are doing 2 or 3 jobs. So there's no doubt about that this time round it's much more difficult. The kind of missionary zeal that might have been there, the innovation that might have been there at this time last year, just isn't, because sometimes things just hurt. And this is really hurting us emotionally and psychologically. Okay,
and Niamh, can I ask you briefly, do you think people are still fully on board with the things that are being asked of them in relation to restrictions, or has social cohesion been affected by this?
I think, to be perfectly honest, I think it's starting to fracture. I think there are a couple of things responsible for that. I think the very sustained and long nature of the lockdown in Ireland compared to other countries is starting to take its toll. One of the things that's critical, I suppose, to recognise is that Ireland and the UK are very proximate to each other. So many Irish people have family who live in the UK, and the greater rollout of the vaccination programme there, I think, is leading to frustrations here and indeed in Northern Ireland. We're seeing this evidence not only in very obvious lockdown protests, we're seeing it with the rise in antisocial behaviour, we're seeing it with people saying, I'm just going to open my business. I think that's not surprising. I think these are not surprising responses considering the length of the lockdown we've had. So I do personally think that the social cohesion around the public health response is starting to fray.
OK, we'll talk more about that in a minute. But one word that came up over and over again when we asked you what you missed most the past year was hugs. And one person trying to compensate for that is a sculptor from County Cavan who's sending handcrafted hugs around the world.
I don't think any of us ever imagined that we'd be talking about missing hugs. It was one of those things that we all took for granted, and, you know, maybe in the future we won't. During the first lockdown in 2020, Cootehill Arts Festival approached me and they asked me to respond in one word to the question, what does lockdown mean to you? So my response was contact. The contact that we all had with each other had been taken away, be it a hug, a handshake, a kiss, all of that was gone. So when the realisation came that contact was missing, it seemed obvious to me to make a sculpture of people embracing, because it was the one thing that we missed the most. People have been sending it as a gift to loved ones that they can't visit. Usually it's a mother or a sister or a friend. When people are living abroad, it's especially poignant because they haven't been able to come home. They can't visit. And some of the messages include to a grandparent from a grandchild they've never met because they're living in a different part of the world. Or messages just to tell someone they're missing them and that they're looking forward to having a hug for real. When the day comes when we can hug each other again, it will be the most heartfelt of hugs.
Well, Paul, looking at that, it does kind of make you ache for a hug, doesn't it? And hugging is probably something that was most important when it came to consoling people. Grief has been a big part of the past year. Talk to us about that.
I mean, you know, Samantha, if we've been to a funeral in the last 12 months and not being able to hug someone that we love when they have lost someone that they love, it's heartbreaking. It can feel like the most unnatural thing in the world not to hug someone when they're in distress. And as we were saying, you know, when we are stressed, when the nervous system is activated, it responds to touch. It responds to that tight hug. That's what tells us, almost before the thinking brain gets involved. It says to us, this is safe and it's okay. And of course, we're living in a situation now where it's not safe. And what once would have been the most reassuring thing in the world, to be embraced and held close, is now actually quite dangerous.
And we're dealing with grief in so many different ways. Talk to me a bit about that.
Well, I think that there's the big grief, the huge big grief, and the pain of grief for people who've lost someone that they love. I mean, it's been... I think the brutality of bereavement over the last 12 months is something that's going to take us a long time to deal with as a society, the loss and the absence of hugs. And then there are all of the other the kind of more minor losses, the smaller griefs, you know, this idea of the lost year. And sometimes we say, well, look, you know what, I didn't lose my job, or I didn't lose someone I love, so I'm all right. You know, I can't complain. And I'm kind of saying to people more and more, you know what, you can actually. Because it's a little bit like, you know, that response, oh, that's my first world concerns. And that's something that always irks me, because I go, no, those small losses are really, really important. And if we can acknowledge them.
And Niamh, coming to you, distance has been a big theme of the past 12 months. But do you think what has happened here has changed the way we think about distance?
It has. I mean, to pick up on the sculptor there, one of the big issues that's emerging is what we call transnational lives. So there are many people who have loved ones and family members who moved away on the understanding that they would be able to come back a couple of times a year, or that they would be able to travel out to them. They are finding this period of lockdown particularly painful, and we are seeing people make quite profound life-changing decisions. So for instance, not just in Ireland but across Europe, there are people moving out of city centre locations to countryside locations. There also are people moving home, essentially, both from cities in Ireland to the countryside, but also from abroad back to Ireland. So that pain of stretching over distance, many people seem to be finding unsustainable in a period where they can't make those periodic visits home. And that's, I think, a significant change, and one that will have long-term consequences.
And if you touched on it there, loneliness is something many of us have been feeling over the past 12 months, and it can impact anyone of any age. During the pandemic, there's been a striking shift when it comes to who's feeling lonely, as we'll hear now.
Traditionally, when we thought of loneliness, it was in a very stereotypical way. We thought of older people, a natural part of growing older. But actually, the pandemic has impacted people in so many different ways, and many more people have gained an insight into loneliness. The numbers of people aged 18 to 34, their level of loneliness in November last year was around 1 in 4 people of that age group felt lonely always or often.
And Paul, staying with that, can I ask you what you think of just how lonely a year it's been for people?
Sure, it's probably been the loneliest year for most people, the loneliest year that most people have lived, and managing that loneliness. You know, the first and most important step is to acknowledge it. We have a tendency to minimise that and go, as I said, you know, I haven't lost anyone. I'm doing okay. Actually, at the heart of this, where most people are lonely, we're lonely for the chat. We're lonely for the incidental things that happen when you bump into a colleague on the corridor. Those small things that keep us alive, that give us perspective. So as difficult and as challenging as it is, that reaching out I know we're all exhausted with Zoom, but finding ways to reach out to manage that loneliness is really, really important.
And Niamh, coming to you, I've heard a lot of people say over the last few months that because they're working from home and they've spent so much time at home, they're kind of afraid that they've lost their ability to socialise with people. Do you think what's happened over the past 12 months will change us as social creatures?
I do. I have to say, I think in the first instance, my husband often talks about what he calls the pent-up demand, or I'm a great believer in balance in kind of human reactions. So I would expect that once this is over, we will see a great longing to experience, group situations, concerts, choirs, sports events, all of those kinds of things. But I think in the long term, what we've certainly learned is that actually being forced onto Zoom and have facilitated other types of interactions. So there are new links forming. But it's very interesting if we look at what we're learning about friendship, is that it seems that many deep friendships have survived and even deepened during the pandemic period, because people have been experiencing all the stresses that Paul has been talking about there. But the more casual interactions, which do humanise us in many ways, those seem to have fallen by the by. And it'll be interesting to see how we pick those up long term. There's some really interesting research on SARS in Hong Kong and the impact that had long term on how people interacted, on their views of what good and bad behaviour is in the public domain. So I would expect that we'll see fairly long-term impacts of this one. But I think there's a particular case to be made for single people in particular, and the kind of loneliness that they're experiencing. And I would have a concern that would have impact on their mental health long term.
OK, so in the midst of a pandemic, how do we find positivity? Experts say we should deliberately seek out positive things, no matter how small they are. Let's hear more on this.
The things that we know from research work: simply smiling. So the more you smile, the more your positive emotions are increased. So trying to find ways that you can engage in smiling, whether it's watching something funny or having a funny conversation with a friend. Connection is important. And I know that's tough with a lot of isolation. But the interesting thing from research is that micro moments of positivity, even with strangers, can be beneficial to our health and wellness and increase our positive emotions. So just smiling at the person in the shop behind the mask when you're making an exchange in a retail setting, that can be something that builds positive emotion in you and in the person at the other side of the counter. Getting out in nature, experiencing awe are things that most of us can do depending on what our 5K restrictions are like. If you can't get out in nature, find ways to experience awe by looking at National Geographic, reading things that are awe-inspiring. We know that awe is a really good positive emotion to have, and it makes us feel that there's a bigger world out there.
And staying on that positive note, Niamh, do you think that there's the potential that our lives will change for the better as a result of the last 12 months we've been through?
Yeah, I do. And I think to look at the positive side, first of all, I think many people have learnt about resilience. They've learnt about, and it's not a word I particularly like, but we've certainly all had to dig deep. Actually, I think there's a really profound new appreciation of the natural world and of our own local environments. Also, the other thing is most of us have been forced to learn new skills that we can now take with us into the post-COVID world. And the final thing is that, the vaccine is on the way. I know it's really slow, but there is some hope on the horizon, which is different to where we were this time last year. And I think that's something that's really important to hold on to in the context of all those other things where there are and have been some positives emerging out of the last 12 months. And
Paul, there was a sense, I suppose, at the end of last year, people thought we're nearly out of this. We're what are we, March now? We still don't know where it's going. So how do you keep a positive mindset?
Are we there yet? Are we there? No, we must be there. Okay, so I think two really, really important things. Number one is lower your standards. We cannot expect the same level of productivity from ourselves as we can in normal times. So aim for doing your imperfect best. So when it comes to taking care of the people you love, those things that matter in life, do your imperfect best. Park perfection. number one. Number two, and it's come up from several of us today, but resetting the nervous system. So the green and the blue, getting out to places where there's a bit of green, there's some forest, there's some park, there's a bit of blue sky or the water. Really important in down-regulating the nervous system that for a lot of us is on threat. You know, that's really important. And number three, and finally, that idea of just acknowledging all the little losses, all the little things that haven't happened this year. So take a moment, write them down, say them to a friend. When we name them, we tame them.
Okay, some great tips there. Well, we're out of time here, but you can keep the conversation going in the comments section. Thanks to Paul Dalton and Niamh Hourigan. And while hugs might be on hold for now, we can look forward to those precious moments in the future. Stay safe and keep well.